Hello, my name's Elijah Wells, and today I'm releasing my top films of 2025, so let's get on with it. But first, some honourable mentions. Companion, Mission Impossible The Final Reckoning, Thunderbolts, Predator Badlands, and K-pop Demon Hunters. And now, time for the top 10. At number 10, after he got my attention with his 2019 masterpiece at his Parasite, he finally came back after a very lengthy hiatus and a couple of delays here and there with Mickey 17, which is at number 10. With Robert Pattinson as the reprintable and expendable soldier in a space colony in a icy planet, which is again some really interesting stuff about your own mortality and the pretty much the ethics and reasonings around human cloning and reprinting them, and of course a lot of pretty enthralling action and a lot of political allegories. That's pretty much what is trademark of what you should expect from a Bong Joon-ho movie. Particularly, this is his third English language movie after like Snowpiercer and Okja. But what I definitely did really like about the Mickey 17 movie is how really quippy and really off-kilter that's what you would usually associate with a Bong Joon-ho movie, as in it's somewhat of like a Roald Dahl movie, as in it's somewhat quippy and somewhat quirky, but can get pretty darn dark pretty quickly. But in a way that feels somewhat whimsical, that balances itself off again, so that's why Mickey 17 is at number 10. At number 9, we're taking another a film that started off in 2019, and of course it's still staying really strong as in today. We are talking about number 9, it's Wake Up Dead Man, Knives Out 3. And of course, Danny Craig is at it again with another Christie story about a murder mystery set in the middle of a church. But of course, it gets a lot more kooky and much more bizarre than one would imagine, with a lot of backstabbing, a lot of betrayals, and a lot of like intriguing twists, and a lot of intrigue, and a lot of really nuanced backstories of all the major characters, and it keeps you on your toes, it keeps you guessing from every turn, and of course the final twist ending is of course really satisfying and definitely very rewarding, and definitely feels really earned of well, it's basically what you should expect right now from a Rian Johnson movie, as in it's particularly with his Knives Out trilogy. Like this is from someone who's proud of his creation, as someone that really loves and really relishes in his own art, and basically someone who really likes what he's doing with this little reinvention of the murder mystery. And of course, I'm ready to see what he does next with the Knives Out films. At number 8, we have the Benny Safdie movie, The Smashing Machine, with Dwayne The Rock Johnson and Emily Blunt in the movie, with Dwayne The Rock Johnson starring as the UFC fighter Mark Kerr, and particularly his struggles with opiates, and of course his dwindling results in the UFC matches, and of course his already fragmented and already vulnerable marriage that he's having, and of course how his world is pretty much somewhat more tormented, more thorny, and pretty much more broken apart pretty much after his rehab stints, and pretty much you're seeing an athlete somewhat being more and more deconstructed. Pretty much what like A24 did a couple of years back with, let's say, the Iron Claw, as in it's a deconstruction of an athlete rather than more of a celebration of it and a glamorization of it. Pretty much looking into their struggles without in a way that's condemning them, but almost in the sense that you're pretty much sympathizing with them, with their struggles, essentially. That was at number 8, being The Smashing Machine. Now, of course, Dwayne The Rock Johnson delivers a powerhouse performance. Like, I'll be fuming if he doesn't get like an Oscar nomination out of this. Like, his performance is incredible. At number 7, we have a comic book master as worked with James Gunn's The Superman movie, with David Costaswet as the titular hero as himself, as Superman and Clark Kent. As in this is definitely one of the more fun films I've definitely seen in cinemas today, and definitely one that I would definitely want to see more and more of, particularly with Man of Tomorrow coming out in 2027, which is again already a bit of a big deal in my books, and as well as Supergirl, who has a brief cameo in this movie, and of course I'm already sold on it already. Like, the performances as a more vulnerable and more cocky Superman is definitely incredible for David Kozowitz, and of course the direction of a more fun and more upbeat version that's more in tune with, like, let's say, the Christopher Reeve films and the Richard Donner films, and was completely steering away from more darker, more meditative films, like say Zack Snyder, and of course exposing how really cult brain the Snyderverse has now just become at this point. But anywho, this is definitely has some really cool action scenes and definitely some really clever set pieces here and there, and also a really fun soundtrack. Particularly, I'm still not over the fact that James Gunn uses No One in Wales 5 years time when of course there was a breaking out in a military camp, which is again definitely one of the more fun scenes in this movie. And of course, kindness is punk, particularly with number 7, that is Superman. At number 6, we have the Ryan Coogler magnum opus, that is Sinners, after his breakout role in Creed, and of course his directorial stuff, that is the Black Panther films, being the first one, and the second film being Wakanda Forever, and of course pretty much his most pivotal directorial role that we have at the moment, which is Sinners. Again, a very beautifully shot movie that's basically a tribute to the African American experience, particularly during the Jim Crow era in the 1930s. And of course, the very interesting role that music plays, pretty much plays into their culture around that point, not just in their past, but also in their present, but also in their future, as well as intertwining all the other cultures, particularly in that one scene where it's the I Lie to You being sung by the incredibly brilliant Miles Cotton in this movie. The performance in this movie is all around incredible, like Michael B. Jordan playing 2 roles in this movie, and Haley Steinfeld pretty much stealing the show, and of course, Ramus being one of the most intimidating and one of the most memorable villains of this year. And of course, the music in this movie is incredible, the action scene is intense, the gore is definitely satisfying at best, the cinematography is particularly done on IMAX film at 70mm is definitely one of the most gorgeous of this year. And pretty much it's a movie that pretty much explores the boundaries of cinema, and not just in the past history, but also where it could go in the future and where it is now, which is, again, a really telling thing, particularly with Warner Brothers being sold off to Netflix. And if this is one of the last major things we ever see of Warner Brothers in the big screen, and I feel like this could be a decent farewell, but I'm not going to count on the Netflix and Warner Brothers merger being a success. But again, number 6 is Sinners. From one of the most enthralling horror movies, now we go to one of the most funniest comedies of the year with number 5, Naked Gun. A reboot with Liam Neeson at the helm, and of course being produced by the comedy maestro, that is Seth MacFarlane. And of course, this is a movie that not just embraced the original as well as the genre of parody cinema and parody comedy, but understood what made it really popular to begin with, and definitely understood why it was such a respected genre back in the day, rather than the 2000 stuff where it's just pop culture reference on pop culture reference. But what made Naked Gun really work on its own, and particularly in my case definitely surpassed probably the original films of Leslie Nielsen, is not just of its self-awareness and its ability to go on the deep end of the silly and much more campy area, but also tackle some pop culture references without coming off as too dated or too cringe or somewhat hammering it down in a sense. But it's definitely done in a way where it's definitely a lot more raunchy and definitely a lot more silly about it, to the point it definitely does bring a smile and a lot of laughs to me, particularly as someone that really likes the stuff like, let's say, Airplane, and of course the Naked Gun original trilogy with Leslie Nielsen and Priscilla Presley, and of course O.J. Simpson, who would just say, again, this is an incredibly funny comedy that definitely stood the test of time. Particularly, it's also being directed by Akiva Shonzoba, who did the Lonely Island music videos, which again goes to show that when you have all these comedic maestros like Seth MacFarlane and the other guy from Lonely Island, and of course the person, Liam Neeson, who's rarely ever does comedy in my opinion, but with the exception, let's say, Million Ways to Die in the West, pretty much shows that he definitely has a comedic spark in his body, and he definitely let it shine. And at number 4, we have a tie, as in it goes to Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein and Disney's Zootopia 2. With Frankenstein, definitely the standout in that movie is Jacob Elordi's incredibly human performance of a monster created by a man who tries to play God. And of course, it's about Frankenstein trying to answer questions about his god being the one that created him, being Dr. Frankenstein. Pretty much played by a lot more egotistical and somewhat of a really unlikable Oscar Isaac in this movie, as someone who wants to reverse death but makes an immortal creature that doesn't understand his own consequences of his own actions. And of course, like a lot of Guillermo del Toro movies, the set decoration is incredibly on point. The costuming work is definitely really nice to look at. The cinematography is glamorous, and of course the music is definitely well done. The performances of Oscar Isaac, Maya Goth, and of course Jake Elordi are definitely really strong highlights in this movie. And of course we go over to Zootopia 2. Again, definitely definitely on point with the original movie, and definitely has some delightful moments. Definitely some a lot of political intrigue, some societal interest in this movie, particularly how the city is definitely founded and the really big conspiracy that completely shakes the city down to its core. And of course, it's very interesting, particularly with Luxie, with the Canadian Leaks or Luxie's family, being one of the most intriguing, one of the most interesting antagonists that we definitely had all year round, in my opinion. But what really sells it is definitely this is a sequel that knows the original films like its world building is definitely really massive. So in a way to honor it, it made it even more massive without like overcomplicating it or like adding way too much of the lore to a point it makes it too hard to follow. But in a sense, that definitely congratulated the fans of the original movie with the something that's in 9 years of awaiting, and of course. It's something we never knew we needed, but definitely something we definitely wanted at the end of the day. And now we go to number 3 to go to a Josh Safdie masterpiece, that is Mighty Supreme, as in Timothée Chalamet definitely plays one of the most memorable characters of all year, as in playing Marty Mauser as definitely this crude, vulgar, immature tennis player who wants to rise up in the rankings of the table tennis world, but of course has to do a lot of hustling and do a lot of like weird things to order to stay financially afloat, like having a fling with an actress and having a numerous amount of affairs, and of course touring with the Harlem Globetrotters. Again, some very interesting, some really offbeat, and definitely some really bizarre moments that you do see the main character just throw himself into, whether he wants to or not, whether he does owe up to it at the end of it or not. But definitely what rounds him up as a character is how really well developed he is from start to finish. Like, you see him as an immature brat at the end, and you see him pretty much recognizing the consequences of his own action and deciding to live with it rather than just completely fight it anymore, which is again a very intriguing way of a character who isn't defeated by any sense of the world, but somewhat becomes more immature about it and just learns about it through his really silly and petty actions. Like, again, the performances with Gwyneth Paltrow is definitely amazing as this washed-up actress who somewhat takes an homage to like Persona or Sunset Boulevard as a washed-up actress who's starting in theatre, which again, some really great stuff right there. And the table tennis playing, which is again really seductive and definitely really beautifully shot. And the music being done by new wave and 80s synth pop music is albeit bizarre at first, but it does make sense when you realise that it's definitely in a sense that the character is like looking way into the future but alienates the people around him, which is again definitely where you can get the sense of the number 3 film on my list being Mighty Supreme. And at number 2, we went from a offbeat, off-kilter comedy to a really dour and somewhat really down-on-the-earth movie called Hamlet, being directed by Chloe Zhao, which is, again, a phenomenally beautiful movie which boasts some incredible performances by Paul Mescal, Jesse Berkley, and of course has some gorgeous cinematography and some incredible set design. It pretty much depicts a family that has pretty much fallen apart and grieving, not just with the loss of a son, Hamlet, but also that William Shakespeare is pretty much now an absent father in Agnes's life at this point, as in he's going back and forth and largely staying at London so he can just do his plays, and of course she's been left alone to raise a family on her own while he's away, which is again the really out there character dynamic, although not ideally the best or the most healthy, but I'm not a couples therapist in my opinion, but again, this is an incredibly beautiful and somewhat poignant movie about how would one family deal with the loss of a really young kid, particularly their own one of their own, and how really tender Chloe Zhao is, particularly so much so it's her trademark, like her previous films like Eternals or the Oscar-winning Nomadland, and how really tender her approach is, particularly on the world of grief, and how one would be alienated about it, how others would grieve about it, and particularly the closing scene where it takes place in the Globe Theatre, and she watches the performance of Hamlet, which is not all a comedy, but like his previous stuff, but it's a tragedy, and of course an homage to his late son, being Hamnet, which is number 2, Hamnet. And my number 1 favourite film of 2025 is the Paul Thomas Anderson movie, One Battle After Another. Like, this is like an incredible movie, not just on how you watch it like at home or on the big screen, like not just incredible in the standpoint of things, as in the performances are absolutely incredible, the music by Johnny Greenwood is usually on point, and in this case is definitely really on point. The cinematography is incredible, the writing, particularly being based off a Thomas Pynchon novel, Vinland, which is again pretty much goes on his surreal journey, as well as going on the traditional trademarks that you would associate with a P.T. Anderson movie. But what really sets it apart from a lot of these movies is how really relevant this movie is, particularly on America's already very heinous human rights abuses at the moment, particularly what's right now going on in Minnesota with the ICE raids. And of course how one director definitely had to tackle this down, but particularly with an adaptation of one of the most surreal writers out there, being Thomas Pynchon and his novel Vinland, and how he navigates it through, particularly with some incredible performances from pretty much a lot of people involved, like Leonardo DiCaprio is incredible in this movie, Sean Penn is brilliant despite being such an awful, nasty piece of work that he is, and Benicio del Toro, despite being somewhat briefly in this movie, he definitely is a strong highlight in this movie, but the one great performance in this movie is definitely the debutee, being Chase Infinity, as Bob's daughter in this movie, or Leonardo DiCaprio's daughter in this movie, who's absolutely knocks it out of the park. Like, definitely, in my opinion, probably one of the best performances of 2025. Like, everything about this movie pretty much reeks of a master who's we all thought he made it big with like films like The Master or Magnolia or There'll Be Blood, but no, at this point, this is his masterpiece. This is the moment where he bursts into flames and rises above all his own movies like a phoenix in the sky. Like, this is a director who is just one of the most consistently brilliant directors, and he's only now getting the full amount of attention from everyone around him. Like, he is just that director that, regardless how his films perform in the box office, like let's say if it flopped, like let's say Inherent Vice, or did relatively well, like There'll Be Blood, but there comes a point where you have to look at that movie and say, yes, this is the moment where things did possibly turn around for P.T. Anderson, as he's not just considered one of the greatest of filmmakers of our generation at this point, but probably of all time. Like, this is the very moment where his legacy is permanently solidified in gold, as in this is the moment where he tackled a deeply relevant subject matter which not a lot of directors may be comfortable with, and did it with somewhat chaotic energy and some satirical bite to it, and pretty much makes it a reason why One Battle After Another is my favourite film of 2025. So, what do you think of my list of the top 10 films of 2025? Let me know in the comments down below, subscribe to my channel, like this video. You can also follow me on Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky and Threads, and Letterboxd and Disliked Wells, and bye.